Good morning, everyone, and happy Monday. I hope that your day and week is off to a wonderful start. I wanted to start my day off by sending this video of thanks for tuning in to the Black Salt World podcast with Dwayne R. Stallworth for the past couple of weeks. I've enjoyed doing them, and I've enjoyed even more engaging in conversation about this topic of blackness and what it means to live, survive, and perhaps thrive in this American context as black people. And so I've always been intrigued with how people approach, of course, different subject matters based on their lived experience with family, education, culture, exposure, all these different components come into play. And so it varies in terms of how people dissect and produce a thought about something as complex of being black in America, right? It's so multifaceted. But the purpose of the Black Sub World is to not only identify these complexities, but also engage them at various levels through, you know, various perspectives. And so that's what I've seen over the past couple of weeks in the comments and questions that I've received regarding the content and the overall thrust and the thesis of the platform, which is to discuss how power, privilege, and black culture all comes together. And so also I wanted to present this idea that I have because of the content and because of the potential questions that may arise. I wanted to do something in addition to the podcast that is produced. And so to nuance that conversation just a bit further, I wanted to implement what I would call the footnote session that will be aired on the Black Sub World channel on YouTube. And from time to time, I will nuance the conversations that I have raised over several weeks, perhaps, and talk more directly to some of those facets that I raised. And so that's the purpose of the footnote video, is to go just a bit further and concept and explanation as to why perhaps this thing exists, and what does it mean for it to exist in perhaps this here and now moment. And so that's the purpose of the video footnote, and I hope that you all will go on, subscribe, and follow me in that space as well. But for today, I wanted to talk just a bit about what we have explored over the past couple of weeks. And if you threw everything in a lump sum, we are basically dealing with notions about black leadership, the need, the drastic need for better education in this country. And I want to throw something else in that gumbo, and that's this notion about generational curses. And we don't necessarily have to put a religious spin on this notion of generational curses. And of course, more often than not, people will align it to biblical text and understanding how people are affected from one generation to the next because of something that their forebears did. And those things are real at a surface level, but at an unconscious level as well. And so that's when you get into understanding systemic pressures on society, when you see it at a conscious level, but you also see it at an unconscious level. And this is what we see in America. Some people intentionally um, try to divert attention from truth, black and white. Um, that's their purpose. They know the fallacies in their arguments. Nevertheless, they're going to argue their point because they feel that that is how they're trained, perhaps, to think and process their worlds and their realities. So they're justified by doing so because they feel that they were given a skill set to do so. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that notion. I think it's very, from a black perspective, it's very much Eurocentric in nature, which puts blinders on an analysis when it comes to unearthing truth in black space. Because, I mean, logically, black space was created by white space as a means to control the black masses. And that's not an extreme comment or an extreme notion. This is the truth. Now, it has expanded over time, but particularly when we discuss, the watchdogs, the black watchdogs, they knew what they were doing in that instance. They knew how to infiltrate a small group of Africans to control them, gather information. Um, it was just a very systematic way of dealing with this new group of people. And that mentality has not shifted much over the centuries. So when we talk about black leadership, we have to ask how much of that is laid upon the back of the black leader. And if we're honest with ourselves, if this is a space, if the slave ship was a space that really created this notion of blackness, this unified understanding of collective suffering, trauma, and the like. There's this common heritage there, right? And if we acknowledge that, and we acknowledge that ultimately a white structure provided this context and constructed terms of how to negotiate this terrain for black people. You know, the overseer, there's privilege there, there's power there, but ultimately the overseer acts at the behest of the master. So there are layers and levels of power to this thing. Do we have those type of attachments today? Is the question. Do we have black people operating in black space at the behest of a white power structure? And I don't necessarily want to unravel the depth of that notion in this video, but it can certainly be done. And I will simply say, at a base level, follow the money. What has pushed people into a space of leadership? What is funding this campaign, et cetera, et cetera? And that's how we have to look at black leadership. Are you operating on the behalf of oppressed black people at every level of life? Because it varies. My level of oppression, as an educated black man, it's not the same as an uneducated black man growing up in South Central LA. And for me to pretend that we're equal in terms of our exposure to this structure is, it would simply be a fallacy. Um, yes, oppression at both levels, but because of the intricate nature of black space, I am perhaps layers above that. Not because I'm better, it's because of the sociological dimension. It's a social structure as well. That person's area may be highly policed, in a very aggressive manner, whereas I'm in a community that is not highly policed. But even in this community, I'm suspect, um, because I don't necessarily fit into the social order. It puts up with me, but it was not structured for me. And so that's a dimension that I have to appreciate. And that comes through education. That's the other component. You know, again, as I stated, I think perhaps in the first week, you know, the lived experience of being black and having the privilege of engaging it at an academic level, for so many years, I think has allowed me to see, um, things more clearly than I did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so I think there is a growth, process. There is maturation involved with one's blackness. We're not at all levels in terms of our knowledge base. And some of that knowledge base perhaps should be removed because it's not ingrained and entrenched in truth. It's not reality. Um, so we have to ascertain exactly what is truth for us. What does it mean to be black, and to understand that question and to engage that question, we have to go back and look at what brought us here. Um, that's on a generational scale. If you look at your family, look at some of the components that you have in your family, and go back a generation, and then another and another, and you get into a genealogy, that can give you a context of what you're dealing with, psychological level, biological level. So that information that's a part of education, is going back, looking at who we are, but also thinking about moving forward. That has been the challenge for Black people, um, and because that is such a critical piece, there hasn't been much movement, um, overall. Now, for some, it has been wonderful, but we're not. Some people can't bring Black people out of this state of societal oppression. It has to be more of a collective. So there has to be, a grassroots understanding of what's going on, and there has to be a high level, um, intellectual engagement as to what needs to play out and how it should play out in conversation with the grassroots. That's an educational explosion because, um, we're removed, so much generationally in terms of how we understand, oppression. Just a few years ago, um, there was a movement about, this being a post-racial society, and people were following that thread, and to a degree, they still are following, this thread, and even those who are attempting to be anti-racist perhaps are missing the mark by suggesting that color doesn't matter, that we're all human. This is true, but color does matter because human beings made it matter. And because labels and psychological constructions were placed on these things, we have to consider that in this here and now moment. Now, ultimately, we do want to be in a society where race does not matter, but we're not there yet, and there's a lot of work that has to be done unearthing exactly what we're dealing with. And so that brings us to understanding our role in generational curses. For some people, it's very difficult to detach from emotional bonds. And so when we talk about black leadership, that cuts at the core for a lot of people. And I'm speaking in particular about VP Harris. She has a lot of attachment to black space at different levels. But those levels are claimed on blackness. And blackness is connected to a history of systematic oppression. And so for her and others, whether you're talking about Claiborne, whether you're talking about Scott, or whomever, it still deals with this reality of fact versus fallacy. And it's dangerous because either this person knows that this is a fallacy, and so through political maneuvering decides to do that at the risk of emboldening folk who already have this notion, and to further embolden them to go out and commit violence against black bodies. That's dangerous. So those type of statements are really pulling back the cover and saying, no, what they're talking about doesn't exist. And it reinvigorates what so many activists over the past several years have tried to attack and engage. And so when I hear those statements from black people, whomever, whoever is in that position, if they are a black person, I'm not talking about a brown person, talking about a black who presents as black, as a descendant of slaves. Yes, I take issue with that type of power that is being abused because I know the risk. I know that there's someone out there listening to her, and it's what we have charged Donald Trump with, dog whistling. It's just at a different level, but it is very much a wink to say that I'm not with them. That's problematic, right? And so the generational curse, beyond the supernatural inclinations associated with that, I'm simply talking about something such as saying systemic racism doesn't exist, passes the battle on to the next generation with no ammunition. And so that also raises a flag because it's a delay tactic. I'm not going to deal with it, so I'll just put it off. But that also entails people enjoying that space while they are alive. So they're sucking up all the energy, they're sucking up all the power, they're sucking up all the juice, and leaving nothing for future generations to deal with, or to share, to embrace, to enjoy. So it's all about the here and now moment for me. It's not about what is to come. And this is going to be a struggle that goes on for generations if black people get serious about the battle, it is going to be a generational battle. And so what I'm seeing now is these gaps and generational inheritance. It's not an inheritance that gives strength, courage, power, resources to continue the fight. It's just their ability to hopefully survive. Hey, I did it, so can you. So those type of mentalities we have to address. And unfortunately, I believe um, when it comes down to it, when you talk about white oppression, that has been so. White supremacy is sinister. Um, it has done a wonderful job at reinforcing its position. It has, um, you know, constructed a switch just in case it comes to the brink of demise. And that switch is black leadership. Ultimately, the saving grace of white supremacy will be those at the door holding off the black masses. Now, I'm not saying this is not to suggest that all black politicians are unethical, untethered to the position of oppression for blacks in this country. That's not my position. I don't know enough at that level. I do know some, but I'm not making that broad stroke. But what I can look at um, actions from previous black leaders at different levels and critique it from that position. Not so much of what was said, but what was done. How did they vote on issues? What things were brought to bear? Um, and so those are some of the concerns that I have in relation to the two episodes that I've put out thus far. And the last thing I want to bring up, not go in depth, but to bring up is this issue of reparations. And there's a lot to be said there. This has been an issue for quite some time. But to put it in the context of where I am currently, suggesting that they want to study an issue for several years to determine its validity is some of the dumbest I've ever heard. But it's a delay tactic. You know, as long as that period is there, people are being elected. They're still carrying on campaigns. They're still in positions of power, gaining more power. And when that cycle is up, they will present something else to extend it. So those are delay tactics to not really deal with issues, but to give enough space to remove people from the issue. And you do that enough issues will come to bear in life where some things that you argue for in the past really don't matter considering the current state. And so those are some of the psychological and political games that I see from black leaders as well as white leaders. And I think it needs to stop. I think there has to be a better way to live in this world. And it is not going to be at the demise of simply white supremacy. It is going to also be, it will have to be the demise at the demise of of black supremacy. Those who feel that they have a better space, a better lot within the white world, and they're willing to settle for that, that little bit, rather than fight for the progression of others to have just a little bit more. This is important considering the wealth gap in this country and where black people are and everyone else. Half of 1% or less than half of 1%. You know, some people are doing well. Overall, as a people, we're not there. So that's it for this video, this footnote, on, you know, topics such as black leadership, education, and this notion of generational curses. We are cursing our generations when we don't address these issues. We're just simply doing a delay tactic, just like they are, and passing it on, saying we dealt with it, but we're trying to survive and get the best out of life. You all would have to do the same thing. You have to learn how to survive and get the best out of life. And then they pass on the same trauma, the same issues to their generations. And it has to stop.